2nd, 1947, the sun rose over the hills of a new Manchuria, born from a brutal struggle of ideologies waged across the land of the Manchus. In the capital, Harbin, life had begun to return to normal as the work of rebuilding Manchuria, backed by private capital lent by Japanese business magnates, began in earnest. In the prime minister's residence lived Wang Yongjiang, Manchuria's new prime minister. As he pored over his files and memos, Wang felt daunted by the enormous task that lay ahead of him. Now in his 75th year of life, Wang Yongjiang wanted nothing more than a quiet retirement after a tumultuous career in politics shaped by the collapse of the Qing dynasty nearly 4 decades prior. But this was not a luxury he could afford, for Manchuria needed him now more than ever. On that day, Wang Yongjiang met with General Benjamin Davis, the Supreme Commander of United States Forces Manchuria, Asakawa Kanichi, the newly appointed American ambassador to Manchuria, and General Takagi Masao, commander of the Manchurian Armed Forces, all of them newly appointed following the end of the Manchurian Revolt. It was on this day that a difficult discussion would be had. General Davis would share with the other men that President Truman saw Wang's government as dead on arrival after Manchuria's narrow victory against the Communists. Expanding upon the thoughts of General Davis, Ambassador Asakawa would lay out the mindset of the new Manchurian-American relationship. Essentially, now that the Americans had almost single-handedly rescued the entire Manchurian government from destruction, they would have a far greater influence on the nation than before. The Far East Command had demanded control of the Manchurian armed forces be temporarily yielded to Commander Benjamin Davis, and the USFM was ordered to undergo intensive restructuring. While Prime Minister Wang immediately acquiesced to the Americans' demands, General Takagi barely hid his contempt for the Prime Minister's weakness, believing that Wang was foolishly and needlessly ceding his authority to the Americans. However, cognizant of the chain of command, General Takagi swallowed his pride and accepted the decision, ceding control of the armed forces to General Davis, who was now his commanding officer. Additionally, the Americans also doubled the size of their forces along the Yamata Line and formally declared the creation of the Manchurian Demilitarized Zone along the Manchurian-Soviet border, commonly referred to as the MDMZ. In tandem with this expansion came the creation of a massive naval base near Dalian, with some land in the port city being ceded to the Americans. At the very least, some internal affairs were partially still under Manchurian government control. For example, the decimation of the police force across the nation during the Manchurian Revolt had resulted in Wang ordering that the Manchurian armed forces be put in charge of policing under martial law. The army now kept the peace on Manchuria's streets. However, even with some independence, Wang would find that the Americans had embedded themselves deeply within his government. With the Manchurian ministerial cabinet slain during the revolt, the Americans would place themselves in charge of filling the void, with hand-picked pro-American advisors being packed into Wang Yongjiang's government. If there had been any doubt before, it was now clear that the Manchurian Revolt had left the Manchurian government bought and paid for by the Americans. Of course, compared to Stalinism, this was the preferable option, and yet many in the Manchurian government longed for the days of complete sovereignty under Jiang Jingguo and his strong leadership. There was nothing left to do but accept the new reality. In the months following the revolt, Wang Yongjiang and his deputy prime minister, Ruan Zhenduo, would distract themselves from the erosion of their nation's sovereignty by plunging themselves into the task of rebuilding it. One positive aspect of the new American interference was that all subsidies and grants issued for the rebuilding of the nation were monitored by the American military administration in Manchuria, resulting in little to no embezzlement of the urgently needed funds. Throughout the rest of 1947, with their national borders secured and their government's power firmly cemented by American support, the people of Manchuria would sweep the rubble from their streets. They would bury their dead. Bricks and concrete would give shape once more to the destroyed urban sprawls. By December 1947, life would return to normal in most of the major cities, although the Manchurian countryside remained devastated. Manchuria would ring in 1948 with a wave of post-war investments facilitating the rise of Manchurian business conglomerates, known as Fiangtahuri Baita, after the Manchu term for a powerful company. These Fiangtahuri Baita, well enriched by foreign funds, would be subject to partial state ownership and control as part of the new economic strategy devised by Wang Yongjiang, who, some had forgotten, had been Manchuria's economic minister back during the 1920s, an era that saw unprecedented economic success. Fortunately, one of the few businesses that had emerged completely unscathed from the Manchurian Revolt, Harbin Brewery, had been nationalized after the war. As Harbin Brewery became the first state asset to rebound from the economic devastation, the influx of revenue allowed for the entire Manchurian government to be funded by the brewery's alcohol sales, allowing for tax dollars to be used for reconstruction efforts alone. Now, bolstered by Wang Yongjiang's so-called New Economic Theory, which was essentially just state capitalism, Manchuria's economy finally began to grow in January 1948 after months of stagnation. This was due to the massive influx of capital that flowed into Manchuria's coffers following the passing of the Manchurian Relief Act by the United States Congress in the fall of 1947. However, even now, as the nation's fortunes were improving, many were left behind in a cutthroat job market that saw thousands of applicants compete for stable government jobs in construction and bureaucracy. The influx of new capital from America and Japan had already begun to concentrate in the hands of the nation's elites, due to tax cuts issued via decree from Prime Minister Wang, which were designed to encourage economic growth. Sadly, illicit careers, from opium manufacturing to prostitution, would flourish in the massive black market that sprung up after the suppression of the Manchurian Revolt, as the working people of the nation would bear the brunt of the work it took to rebuild it. In this mixture of good and bad, February would see the replacement of the Manchukuo yuan, which had lost its entire value, with a new currency, the benkan, named after the Manchu word for money, which was pegged to the American dollar. The introduction of the benkan would see the creation of opportunities for long-term American investment and deepening trade relations with the nation's American benefactors. March 1948 would see Ruan Zhenduo step down from his position of party leader and Speaker of the Legislative Council. Ruan did so as his health, which had been poor in the aftermath of the bombing, deteriorated amidst several bouts of pneumonia. Aiming to focus solely on his duties as Deputy Prime Minister, Ruan left behind his other roles, knowing that leadership of the Concordia Association, now calling itself the Concordia Party as part of a rebrand, was in good hands. For you see, Ruan Zhenduo had named Council Whip Li Jianglan as his successor, and this was confirmed by an inter-party vote. Ruan later stated that his decision was influenced by Li's actions in Fushun during the revolt, knowing that she had both the will and the charisma needed to carry the party banner forward in the coming years. In addition to Li's ascension to the party leadership came her ascension to the position of Speaker of the Legislative Council. In a unanimous vote, engineered by Ruan to project party unity, the Legislative Council voted to confirm Li Jianglan as Speaker on March 27, 1948. As for the Manchurian armed forces, under the leadership of General Davis, the fighting men of Manchuria would be subjected to multiple audits designed to eliminate corruption within the military. However, it wasn't all bad. General Davis would also fast-track promotions for war heroes who had demonstrated excellence during the Manchurian Revolt. This was because almost all of Manchuria's prior military leadership had been killed. Never before, nor after, would the Manchurian military see such meteoric rises to power. For instance, by April 1948, Captain Iwasato Masao, due to his actions during the siege of Fushun and post-revolt affability and flexibility with the demands of the Americans, would be a general, something which infuriated General Takagi, who viewed Iwasato as a potential rival and usurper of the chain of command. Likewise, to prevent another military collapse, which had occurred after the murder of General Lyushkov and the Manchurian High Command, General Davis would divide the command of the Manchurian armed forces into two spheres of influence. General Takagi, a legendary and extraordinarily popular figure amongst the rank and file, would retain his leadership of the Manchurian army. However, in General Iwasato, General Davis recognized an inherent affinity for technocracy. Due to this, General Iwasato, who was more popular with the government and the Americans than Takagi, would be given control of the Manchurian Air Force and Navy, both of which were severely underfunded and in terrible condition, except for a few elite ships and squadrons. General Davis would entrust Iwasato with the money of the American taxpayers and the responsibility of rapidly bringing the Navy and Air Force up to the minimum standards needed for operational effectiveness. Additionally, a small portion of the military leadership, usually those deemed incompetent and expendable, would be charged with war crimes by Zheng Yushu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Beyond the military, Zheng's investigation would see the arrest of many notable figures across the nation, including even a few within the Manchurian elite. However, whenever Zheng got too close to the top, especially after she wished to charge General Takagi with war crimes, the Americans would halt her activities and redirect her to other figures, since all competent military leaders willing to work with the Manchurian government at this point had indeed committed war crimes in the past. On May 1st, 1948, the Manchurian army would disperse a group of 200 protesters in Harbin during International Workers' Day with water cannons and rubber bullets. Such protests would continually be suppressed for many years to come. During private meetings with Prime Minister Wang throughout March and April, the old man had expressed to Li Jianlan that Manchuria's economy, even now that it was on the mend, was completely unsustainable. If American funding disappeared, it would be anarchy. Likewise, the international community still viewed Manchuria very negatively. Thus, Manchuria needed to find its niche, something to make itself useful and be seen on the world stage, as well as generate economic growth independent of American economic aid. It was from this conversation that Li Jianlan devised a plan to build the fledgling nation's soft power. Li suggested that the government pool its funds to subsidize the rebuilding of the defunct Manchukuo Film Association. It was a Hail Mary effort, but Li Jianlan was able to convince the prime minister of its merits. Imagine a film studio under state control made to produce real cinema that showcased the beauty of Manchuria and told the stories of its people. The film studios and lots, abandoned in 1945, were still standing. Many of the actors had remained in Manchuria after the war. Of course, there is more to movie making than actors and locations. For this issue, Li Jianlan highlighted that Japan was far more devastated than Manchuria. The Japanese entertainment industry was currently moribund. If the government could entice Japanese entertainment assets to relocate to Manchuria, it would help both parties to create revenue. After several meetings, Wang Yongjiang was convinced, working with Li Jianlan to craft a funding bill and make contact with a fledgling Japanese entertainment company, Shintoho, founded by defectors from the Toho Corporation after a labor dispute. An agreement was made to fold Shintoho into the newly reformed and newly renamed Manchuria Film Association, which functioned as a partially state-run entity. On May 5th, the Legislative Council, now headed by Speaker Li Jianlan, would pass a landmark funding bill entitled the Manchurian Cinema Rejuvenation Act. With its passage, work began on rebuilding Manchuria's entertainment industry with the goal of being fully up and running by 1950. June 1st would see the arrival of the Shintoho Company in Xinjiang, with Saso Shozaburo, president of Shintoho, becoming the first president of the Manchuria Film Association. However, as the government celebrated the success of their plan, Li Jianlan would deliver troubling news to Deputy Prime Minister Ruan Zhenduo. On two occasions when Li and Prime Minister Wang had met to discuss the bill, the Prime Minister had experienced episodes of memory loss. During one meeting in April, he had to be reminded about the specifics of a part of the bill he himself had written, and in early May, he had suffered a complete blackout. Although he had retained consciousness throughout it, when he regained lucidity, he had completely forgotten the hours spent working and had to be reminded what he was doing there. Ruan, not wishing to cause any instability, demanded that Li remain quiet about what had happened, telling her he would help to manage any future issues. June 1948 would also see the beginning of a campaign to get Manchuria admitted to the United Nations. The Soviet Union and most of the participatory Asian nations opposed this action in a sufficient number so as to deny the young nation membership. The nation that advocated the most for Manchuria and served as the nation's de facto voice in the UN was one of its oldest allies, the nation of El Salvador. Each session, El Salvador would issue a statement calling for a vote on Manchurian UN membership, although this would be consistently ignored in the aftermath of the Manchurian Revolt, due to the world's overwhelmingly negative perception of Manchuria. In a show of solidarity with a largely unrecognized nation, the president of El Salvador, Salvador Castaneda Castro, would make a state visit to Manchuria on July 2, 1948, where he would meet and dine with Prime Minister Wang Yongjiang and Deputy Prime Minister Ruan Zhenduo. During his visit, Castaneda would manage to work out a deal for tariff-free Salvadorian coffee exports to Manchuria before departing on July 15th. The Salvadorian efforts to ensure Manchurian representation in the UN would only harden the Manchurian government's resolve to improve the nation's image through soft power. The vehicle for this overhaul would be the Manchuria Film Association. At the same time, across Asia, beyond the USSR, Choson, and Japan, the Manchurian Revolt had a profound effect on the process of decolonization. The wave of independence movements that sprung up across South and Southeast Asia were handled very differently than in our timeline. Firstly, the British Raj was already much larger. This was because after the 1935 Japanese invasion of China, Tibet, recently recognized as a sovereign nation by the League of Nations, was admitted to the British Raj in a desperate bid for protection against an invasion by the Japanese. Shortly after Tibet's admittance to the British Raj, the nervous governments of Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim entered as well. On top of this, the Kingdom of Afghanistan had negotiated a suzerainty with the British Raj and a mutual defense treaty, and many considered it to have more or less joined to the Raj as well, just with far more autonomy. Indeed, the process of independence for South and Southeast Asia, which had been stalled since the crisis in China and through the Second World War, finally restarted in 1945. However, this time it started from scratch. After the Soviet annexation of China, British, Dutch, and French concerns about maintaining colonial influence were pushed aside by American concerns regarding the Soviet annexation of all of Asia. If South Asia went red, there would be no military or political counterbalance to the Soviets, thus endangering the anti-communist governments of Manchuria, Choson, the Philippines, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, as well as the rest of the Pacific nations. Original plans for independence were scrapped and started over, shaped by these new concerns. Firstly, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Portuguese India, and French India would have their autonomy revoked and be incorporated into the British Raj. After 2 years of networking and negotiations, July 1947 would see the formation of a Grand Council for South Asia, a task force comprised of numerous representatives from all of South Asia's regions, communities, and kingdoms. The objectives of the council were simple: to ensure peaceful independence for South Asia promptly. While the idea of partition had been seriously considered in the past, in this new world the nations of South Asia found themselves in, many minds had been changed. A new and valid fear of possible communist annexation had left the leaders and future leaders of the region firmly believing that to be alone in independence was a dangerous thing. How long before the communists would revolt as they did in Manchuria? Just like Manchuria, the Soviets were right on the borders of South Asia after the annexation of China. The Grand Council of South Asia would draft a radical proposal, the foundations of which had been in the works for years, to present to the people of their respective nations. A call would be issued and a suggestion made to the representatives of the British Crown for the creation of a massive federalized superstate, the Federation of South Asia. The FSA would be bound by a common currency, have a singular military comprised of soldiers from all regions, and have a centralized defense network. At the same time, the regions, which would become sovereign federal entities, an ambiguous name meant to consider the dignity of the kingdoms and democracies that would form the state, would enjoy near total autonomy when it came to making their own laws. A singular chancellor, envisioned as a public servant to the leaders of the federal entities, would be appointed by a unanimous vote of said leaders. To drum up support, it was said that the OSS spent millions of dollars on a massive propaganda campaign that exacerbated fears of a possible Soviet invasion of South Asia. For many of the peoples living under the British Raj, the Soviets had been a steadfast ally against the British occupiers, who had robbed their lands and slaughtered their people. And yet, with the annexation of China, enough of the population would come to find the proposal for the creation of the Federation of South Asia agreeable. With the regional leaders on board and the relevant intelligence agencies reporting that a safe majority of the people agreed with it, the proposal would be ratified into the Instrument of Federal Coexistence on August 15, 1947. By a unanimous vote, Ngapo of Tibet would be elected as the first Chancellor of South Asia, with the Buddhist Tibetan being put forth as a compromise candidate who is neither Muslim nor Hindu. December 31st, 1947 would see the last British forces withdraw from the region. Following this example, the French, unhappy but equally nervous about growing communist sentiment, would be strong-armed by the United States into granting accelerated independence to French Indochina in the fall of 1947. The independence of French Indochina would see the birth of two states. The first would be the Kingdom of Thailand, comprised of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar Shan State. The second would be the Indochinese Union of Vietnam and Kampuchea, soon nicknamed Anampuchea. This state would be a dual monarchy under the rule of Kampuchea's Norodom Sihanouk and Duy Tan of Vietnam, functioning under a federal autonomy system almost identical to the one employed in South Asia. Lastly came the efforts of the Netherlands, Portugal, the UK, and the US to deal with the East Indies. Once more, the federalized South Asian model was employed to grant independence to the East Indies, with President Truman and Douglas MacArthur believing that the coalescing of the nations into powerful unions would provide a bulwark against communism. In a treaty signed by Manuel Quezon of the Philippines and Sukarno of Indonesia, the Union of Mafilindo, incorporating the Philippines, Malaya, Borneo, Indonesia, East Timor, Brunei, and Singapore, was created. Manchuria would ring in the Western New Year on January 1st, 1949, as a nation undergoing a tumultuous evolution. Tensions between the Fianghahuribaita conglomerates, which dominated the post-revolt landscape, and the Manchurian working class continued to rise as the Americans embedded themselves ever deeper into Manchuria's government. At the same time, the Benkan, Manchuria's new currency, had stabilized and begun to increase in value as the economy continued its recovery. It was during the early months of this year that some within the press began to call for the end of martial law and the holding of new elections. This push for new elections was driven by the deaths of Representatives Yuan Kading of natural causes on January 15th and Representative Ozawa Kaisaku of a myocardial infection on February 1st. With the passing of the two representatives, Manchuria's number of elected officials was reduced to the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Speaker of the Legislative Council, and a whopping two representatives, Jie Jieshi and Zhang Yanqing. However, calls for new elections were rebuffed by Deputy Prime Minister Ruan Zhenduo, who affirmed his support for the continuation of martial law through the end of the year. Interestingly, as some noticed, Ruan Zhenduo had been the one answering questions and issuing statements since December of 1948. Speculation began to grow. Where was Prime Minister Wang? As it would happen, Prime Minister Wang had been suffering a steady decline in his mental faculties throughout 1948, and his difficulties with memory had only intensified throughout the winter of that year. By early 1949, Wang's administrative duties had been significantly reduced as the old man recognized the extent of his decline during the moments of lucidity which grew further apart with time. Of course, for now, the only individuals who knew of his actual condition were Ruan Zhenduo, Li Jianglan, and his loyal house staff. At the same time, while Ruan Zhenduo wished very badly to ascend to the position of prime minister, his own health issues had worsened as well, with him experiencing renewed bouts with bronchitis and a lung infection throughout 1949. While he was in full control of his mind, which allowed him to take over Wang's duties, his body grew ever weaker in the aftermath of the horrific injuries he'd suffered from the bombing of the Legislative Council building. On May 1st, things came to a head when Ruan Zhenduo had to be admitted to the hospital for his lung infection on the same day when he was to be holding a press briefing on the results of a recent census, as well as the progress of the Manchurian economy. At the same time, Prime Minister Wang Yongjiang had been confined to his residence while suffering a psychotic episode brought on by his worsening dementia, the cause of which had recently been diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. With both members of the executive branch incapacitated, Emperor Zaifeng intervened and asked the Speaker of the Legislative Council, Li Jianglan, to stand in for both men in the midst of what the government claimed was a dual family emergency. Speaker Li reluctantly acquiesced to the emperor's request, holding the press briefing at the newly reconstructed Legislative Council building in Harbin. During the briefing, the young politician would announce to a stunned crowd that both the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister had been called away to deal with two separate family emergencies, but that there was nothing to worry about as they had continued to perform their administrative duties during this difficult time. Speaker Li would go on to discuss the formation of new initiatives focusing on improving educational outcomes for Manchurian youth, as well as the news of the Benkan reaching a record high in value. But this isn't what the press wanted to hear. As soon as Miss Li opened up the room for questions, they arrived like machine gun fire. Why was she doing the briefing? Where was the Prime Minister? Where was the Deputy Prime Minister? Why hadn't anyone seen the Prime Minister in months? Maintaining her composure, Li Jianglan responded with the answers which had been pre-approved by Ruan Zhenduo, satiating the press, but making it very clear to both her and Ruan, who'd been listening to it on the radio, that the issue of Prime Minister Wang's health had to be dealt with sooner rather than later. The ongoing problems with the executive branch of the Manchurian government would, as it turned out, not be dealt with. Emperor Zaifeng would be very upset with Wang and Ruan, who both recovered after the press conference fiasco. At the same time, as long as Wang's issues were continually hidden from the public, the bureaucracy would be able to continue implementing his agenda. Accordingly, Emperor Zaifeng would refuse to dismiss Wang during martial law, fearing that his removal would run the risk of inciting challenges to Ruan's legitimacy, and with it, further unrest. Instead, Zaifeng was more than content to let Ruan handle the duties of government from the shadows until Wang died and Ruan replaced him as his designated successor. Following the press conference, the military leadership, specifically Kawashima Yoshiko, Takagi Masao, and Iwasato Masao, would uncover the extent of the cover-up. While Kawashima and Iwasato would go along with the emperor's plans, General Takagi would once again be livid. Now more than ever, Manchuria needed a leader made of steel, not dying men who had lost their minds. Throughout 1949, this precarious order would continue. Retrospectively, many geopolitical scholars look back in awe that things continued this way in Manchuria for as long as they did. However, nothing lasts forever, especially a government of dying old men. Things would come crashing down in the winter of 1949. On November 2nd, 1949, Deputy Prime Minister Ruan Genduo was admitted to Taizong Hospital in Harbin after collapsing at his residence and complaining that he could not breathe, his fifth admittance to the hospital that year alone. After years of ill health, on November 3rd, 1949, Ruan Genduo, Manchuria's de facto head of government, would die of double pneumonia at the age of 56. Emperor Zaifeng, like many others, had expected Ruan to outlast Wang, who was also rapidly declining. With the death of Ruan Jinduo, the full fragility of the Manchurian government was exposed. While the bureaucracy continued to function as it did before, things quickly became disorganized, with no guidance or new orders arriving from the Prime Minister's office. For months, all of the internal memos and orders had been written by Ruan Jinduo, with Wang Yongjiang's signature being forged. By this point, Prime Minister Wang could not even write his own signature. He spent most of his time in a state of dementia-related psychosis and required around-the-clock care. With the executive branch paralyzed, Emperor Zaifeng, under immense pressure from the Americans, would dissolve the civilian government of Wang Yongjiang on November 15, 1949. In its stead, invoking the imperial powers bestowed to him both by the mandate of heaven and the law, the emperor, Manchuria's head of state, would also assume the role of head of government under martial law's imperial prerogative clause, which allowed the emperor to serve as head of government if the current government could no longer perform its duties. Wang Yongjiang, in a moment of lucidity, understood what had happened and wrote a weak, sloppy signature on a document affirming his desire to be removed from office. On that day, Emperor Zaifeng would deliver a speech to the people from the Manchuria Broadcast Tower. To my subjects, this is your Emperor speaking. Today, in consultation with the Legislative Council and USFM, I opted to dissolve the government of Wang Yongjiang, an unceasing Manchurian patriot and tremendous public servant. This development comes after I received a letter from the Prime Minister requesting that he be dismissed due to health issues. Although he has worked for some time without any ill effects, our tireless Prime Minister has long been afflicted by a progressive illness of the circulatory system. Although he has remained fully mentally capable of serving as Prime Minister until now, recently his condition worsened. Accordingly, Prime Minister Wang, in his infinite wisdom, made the difficult realization that he could no longer perform his necessary duties and was thus no longer providing the people of our nation with the best possible leadership. And so, in the interim, I, Emperor Zaifeng, shall rule as both Manchuria's emperor and prime minister under a period of absolute monarchy. But make no mistake, this is not permanent nor is martial law. I plan to relinquish power after the new year whilst our nation continues its careful path to prosperity and eventual democracy. Now, despite recent challenges, our nation is stronger than ever, prouder than ever, and more unified than ever. May the heavens bless Manchuria and all of its people. The dissolution of the Manchurian government came as a shock to all of Manchuria. However, for those who knew of the situation, such as Li Jianglan and the other remaining members of the Legislative Council, Emperor Zaifeng's actions resulted in a sigh of relief that the matter of Wang Yongjiang's health had at last been settled. Likewise, the Iron Blood Party, which had been virtually shut out of the democratic process after the death of Representative Yuan and Prime Minister Wang's loss of lucidity, rejoiced and began preparations to contest the upcoming elections. On December 26th, a banquet was held in honor of the emperor's new government. The festivities continued into the early hours of the morning, when the guests began to depart. One of the last guests to leave, Crown Prince Pu Ren, would bow deeply to his father and wish him well in his quest to guide Manchuria into the future. Pu Ren would travel in his motorcade to the residence of a romantic interest. However, as the car neared a bridge over the icy Songhua River in Harbin, the driver hit a spot of black ice. While struggling to regain control, the car swerved and flew off the bridge, crashing through the ice into the freezing waters below. The other members of the motorcade rushed to help, while some dove into the water to aid the prince, although this would only end up killing them due to the freezing temperatures. At the bottom of the Songhua River, Pu Ren, who had sustained a severe head wound during the crash, would feel nothing as he drowned painlessly, as did the driver. By the time first responders arrived, it was already too late for the Crown Prince. At 3 o'clock in the morning on December 27, 1949, Pu Ren's car would be hoisted out of the icy river, where on-site paramedics would confirm his death. Emperor Zaifeng collapsed upon hearing the news of his son's death. After Puyi and Pujie's disastrous tenure in Manchukuo, Puren was the only heir Zaifeng saw as unspoiled and capable. What would become of the great Qing now? Over the coming days, a feeling of dread and malaise would wash over Manchuria. Emperor Zaifeng, still in shock at the loss of his son, would declare an indefinite period of mourning as he struggled to come to terms with what had happened, his mind consumed with a newfound fear of the future. After his son's passing, the emperor refused to eat, only entertaining small sips of water and rice wine, often sitting alone in his study, deep in his thoughts and his melancholy. Puren would be buried on December 29, 1949. The emperor said nothing as they lowered his son into the earth. On December 30th, 1949, the emperor's servants entered his study to find his imperial majesty had passed in his sleep. The attending physician would declare the emperor's cause of death to be cardiomyopathy caused by stress, also known as death from a broken heart. With the emperor dead, Manchuria's entire executive branch simply ceased to exist. There was no head of state, there was no head of government, there was no leader. The problem which many in the government and military thought had been solved with the dismissal of Wang Yongjiang now came roaring back, worse now than ever before. The news of the emperor's passing was declared in a live radio broadcast by the Speaker of the Legislative Council, Li Jianlan, who was now, for all intents and purposes, the highest-ranking member of the Manchurian government in the line of succession. Li, who remained stoic yet sorrowful in her deliverance of the news, implored the people of the nation to keep their faith in the future. Li would announce that meetings would be held constantly to ensure the transfer of power would proceed peacefully and continuity of government. Furthermore, Li said that the bureaucracy and the military also remained committed to these same goals, and that the daily life of the Manchurian people would not be affected too much by these recent events. Unfortunately for Li, she had been fed incorrect information. The Manchurian succession crisis had begun. On December 31st, the first salvo against the peaceful transfer of power would come from the office of General Takagi Masao, who would relay his concerns in a message delivered to the media and Legislative Council, stating, "I am gravely worried for the future of our nation. With the passing of our dear leader, Emperor Zaifeng, as well as his heir, coupled with the dissolution of our last elected government due to a medical cover-up, I am of the opinion that our so-called Legislative Council, which is now only comprised of 3 people, should not be involved in the succession process at all, for they no longer represent the will of the people." What I see in Li Jianlan's recent statement is that she seeks to capitalize on this tragedy and usurp our deceased emperor to claim power for herself, an inexperienced girl. What Manchuria needs is a proven leader supported by the warriors of Manchuria. The military leadership of our great nation looks forward to playing a role befitting our status in the selection of our nation's next executive. General Takagi's broadside against the Legislative Council would result in political chaos throughout Harbin and the entire Manchurian nation. With so much uncertainty, the Benkan, which had only been growing in value and purchasing power, would rapidly devalue after many American investors pulled their investments from Manchuria until the end of the succession crisis. As a result, the savings of many hard-working Manchurians would be affected, causing social unrest across the country against the machinations of the government and the military. That same day, General Iwasato met with Li Jianlan in the Legislative Council, where he would pledge the support of the Manchurian Air Force and Navy to the side of the Legislative Council. Likewise, a small portion of the army had also come out in support of the Legislative Council following General Takagi's proclamation, with the resistance against Takagi being led by General Chai Myung-shin. In response to Takagi's statement, Li Jianlan and Iwasato Masao delivered a broadcast that same day denying Takagi's claims and stating that they were both committed to a peaceful transition of power and the announcement of the creation of the National Transitional Committee, a governmental body comprised of members of the government, military, and civilian organizations designed to establish an electoral framework for future elections. At the same time, Li Jianlan denounced Takagi's claims that she coveted power, stating that she only wished for peace. However, this would not be enough. Manchuria ushered in 1950 holding its breath. On January 1st, streets across the nation were quiet, and newspapers were riddled with speculation after General Takagi and his military faction declined to issue a rebuttal to Li and Iwasato's broadcast. General Iwasato, deeply concerned about what Takagi was plotting, would reach out to the Americans for support. The response to him from Washington would be curt, with an air of annoyance. The Americans wished for this succession crisis to be over. It didn't matter who led the nation, so long as they weren't communist. Realizing that they were on their own, General Iwasato would mandate military escorts for the entire committee, stationing what soldiers he could currently spare at the Legislative Council to deter any attempt by Takagi to seize power. On that day, the first inaugural meeting of the National Transitional Committee would be held at the Legislative Council, where issues such as imperial succession and internal security dominated the conversation. One delegate from the All Manchu People's Interest Union, a Manchu ethnic advocacy group, would propose that Aisin Jodo Yuzhang, the emperor's grandson, be placed on the throne. However, considering that the entire nation would be relying on the emperor for guidance under absolute rule, this idea was swiftly rejected, considering what had happened the last time a child was made emperor of the Qing dynasty. In response, the committee would draft and approve a preliminary measure calling for the establishment of a Manchurian republic instead, stating that the emperor was irreplaceable and that the only way forward was under a democratic regime. General Iwasato would implore Li to seize her constitutional prerogative and ascend to the office of prime minister, or president, but she refused, convinced that a young woman such as herself attempting to become leader would lead to her immediate overthrow and vindicate Takagi's lies. The only way she could even envision such a thing was if she had the full backing of the military and the Americans, which she did not. The only way forward was to dispel the notions of her coveting power and work within the committee. After the end of the first meeting, Li Jianglan would travel to Harbin's Kitaiskaya neighborhood, where she had a pre-planned meeting with Saso Shozaburo, president of the Manchuria Film Association, as well as the company's board of directors and leading actors and actresses at an acclaimed Russian restaurant. The dinner would serve as a reprieve from the recent stresses of politics, as Li Jianglan was able to reunite with many of her co-stars and old friends from her days as an actress and singer. At the same time, Li Jianglan was waiting on her chief of staff and closest friend, Liuba Gudinets. Miss Gudinets had stayed behind at the Legislative Council to compile papers and reports and was supposed to join Li and the dinner around 7 o'clock. Yet 7 o'clock passed and Miss Gudinets was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, the sound of distant gunfire and screams pierced the conversation. Multiple people arose to look out of the window, only to see that the noises appeared to be coming from the newly rebuilt Legislative Council building. Shortly thereafter, an ambulance flew by, headed towards the building. From below, an anxious waiter rushed up the stairs, begging forgiveness for having interrupted the dinner, but explained that it was urgent. Behind him, another member of the staff helped a young woman up the stairs. She had been shot in the arm. Li Jianglan instantly recognized Liuba and rushed to her aid. Liuba explained that she had been working on some internal memos when an agitated guard rushed into her office and ordered her to leave at once. As it turns out, soldiers loyal to General Takagi had arrived at the Legislative Council and were demanding entry, claiming that they had been vested with the authority to arrest every member of the National Transitional Committee. The defenders of the Legislative Council had refused, leading to a massive confrontation. Just as Liuba had been warned of the situation and told to leave, gunfire erupted, with Takagi's men firing the first shot. In the chaos, Liuba had fled for her life, rushing past dead and dying soldiers and being shot in the arm while running through the crossfire. Liuba Gudinets would then pass out due to her injuries. Shortly thereafter, an ambulance would arrive to take her to the hospital, leaving Li Jianglan in shock. A coup attempt was now underway. Li would call General Iwasato to inform him of what was happening. While this news was not welcomed, General Iwasato could not feign surprise at Takagi's actions. With Takagi searching for her, Iwasato suggested that Li Jianglan go into hiding. Li agreed, which was a wise decision in hindsight considering the fate of the other two remaining representatives. Zhang Yanqing would be caught at his home unprepared. When he resisted the soldiers' efforts to detain him, he would be shot dead. Likewise, Jie Jieshi would also be apprehended, but unlike Zhang, Jie would immediately surrender and pledge his loyalty to General Takagi. By the morning of January 2nd, the Takagi coup was in full swing. Takagi's soldiers, flanked by thugs and criminals from the Russian fascist underground, had spilled out into the streets of Harbin and secured much of the capital. While there had been some resistance from Iwasato loyalists, fighting in the capital subsided by late morning after General Iwasato and the surviving members of the National Transitional Committee fled Harbin to regroup with his loyalists to establish a resistance force to Takagi. Li Jianglan's hiding location was safe for now, but the surrounding area was too compromised to attempt to rendezvous with Iwasato, so Li opted to stay put for now and escape later. That morning, Takagi's forces had completed their raid on the Legislative Council, and afterward, Takagi would greet his men at the central building. It was here that Takagi would declare the creation of a military junta, the Manchurian Armed Forces Council, or MAFC for short. While Takagi retained firm control, the military junta also included his closest allies, Iken Nakajima and Tamashima Shoryu. Additionally, the military junta included a fourth member, Konstantin Rodzaevsky, who had agreed to join the junta as the sole civilian representative following promises by Takagi to create a semi-autonomous Russian ethno-state in Manchuria. That same day, the new junta would performatively elect General Takagi the new prime minister and regent of Manchuria, demonstrating to the people their ability to decisively achieve goals that General Iwasato's faction had needed a committee to accomplish. At the Legislative Council, now the junta headquarters, General Takagi would praise his men for their work and state that today was only the beginning of Manchuria's glorious rebirth. Takagi's first act as prime minister would be the appointment of Jie Jieshu as his puppet deputy prime minister to establish a semblance of legitimacy. Likewise, Konstantin Rodzaevsky would be made Speaker of the Legislative Council after General Takagi declared Li Jianlan's authority to be illegitimate, falsely branding her as a communist sympathizer. Over the next week, Takagi would suspend the constitution, issue a decree reiterating the continuance of martial law, and put out a warrant for the arrest of the fugitive Li Jianlan, as well as make numerous diplomatic overtures to the Americans, who remained reluctant to pick a side so long as General Iwasato remained a serious contender in the battle for the control of the nation. Speaking of the general, Iwasato would mass his forces within the northern Manchurian countryside, which was inherently opposed to Takagi because of his past actions in Moha. However, although Iwasato controlled the Air Force and Navy, the Navy was useless in this situation. The small army faction allied to him, led by General Chai Myung-shin, was not enough to defeat Takagi's forces in open battle. The general weighed his options. A prolonged insurgency could end with him on top, but was that really something he wanted to subject Manchuria to? Could the nation even survive for the chaos, or would Wang Ming and Joseph Stalin capitalize on this and send an invasion force across the border after the first shot was fired? Regardless of his doubts, General Iwasato was left with no choice but to fight when, on January 10, 1950, during a military raid on the studios of the Manchuria Film Association, Speaker of the Legislative Council, Li Jianlan, was apprehended by the Manchurian military junta. To save Manchuria from a Takagi dictatorship, General Iwasato knew he had to fight. The issue of Li's fate would become the predominant topic of discussion amongst the junta members. Tamashima and Rodzaevsky pushed for Li's execution, the former favoring a public execution, the latter a private one. However, Nakajima and Takagi were in favor of possible rehabilitation. General Takagi wanted to portray himself as a reasonable and civilized leader who could make peace with his rivals, not a bloodthirsty despot like Stalin. No, Li Jianlan would remain completely unharmed in his custody, and would instead be given a deadline for her to publicly declare her support for the junta's new government. If she complied, she would be sent into exile in Japan. Her endorsement, as well as the defeat of Iwasato, would surely cause the sectors of the population currently opposed to him to accept Takagi's rule. Following this, General Takagi would have Li Jianlan imprisoned in a detention facility in Hulunbuir. However, Speaker Li would be given her own cell with some amenities, and direct instructions would be given to the guards. No harm was to come to her. However, Li Jianlan was also given a deadline: endorse Takagi's regime publicly by January 15th, or face the firing squad. With Li imprisoned, General Iwasato moved to openly resist Takagi, and plans were underway by January 11th for an initial offensive to reclaim Harbin. Many on both sides saw the coup for what it was: the beginning of a civil war in Manchuria. The ironic fact of the matter was that General Iwasato did see reason in Takagi's push for a military government due to the fact that almost no elected officials remained, but he hated the man himself and those he aligned himself with. As a result, General Iwasato declared his support for the participation of the military within the next government were he to win. However, Iwasato envisioned a constitutionally based hybrid regime comprised of both military leadership and civilians, instead of Takagi's vision of militant totalitarianism. The fate of Manchuria would be decided through the shedding of the blood of her sons and daughters. On January 15th, General Iwasato Masao issued a public declaration via radio that denounced Takagi's actions as reckless political maneuvering that endangered Manchuria's stability and progress, and announced his intent to violently oppose the new government. On this day, the deadline for Li Jianlan to support the new government passed without any word from the imprisoned politician. Speaker Li had remained almost completely silent throughout her imprisonment. On January 16th, Li Jianglong was sentenced to death by firing squad at the Hulunbuir prison, to be carried out on January 20th. Li reacted to the news of the sentence without any emotion, lost in her thoughts and ruminating on the future of her beloved country. On January 17th, the first skirmishes between the forces of General Iwasato and General Takagi broke out just north of Harbin, as Iwasato probed Takagi's defenses, which were found to be far stronger than Iwasato had expected, resulting in his defeat in the Battle of Outer Harbin. In response, Takagi would draft up terms of surrender for Iwasato, offering both him and Li safe passage out of Manchuria if Iwasato were to lay down his arms and go into exile. Shortly thereafter, General Takagi would depart the Legislative Council building to speak at a mass rally in downtown Harbin. Afterward, he was scheduled to meet with American Ambassador Asakawa Kanichi to discuss American recognition of his government, which had at last been put on the table following Iwasato's disappointing first offensive. At noon, General Takagi would arrive to deliver his speech in Japanese addressing the anxious citizenry. To my fellow Manchurians, it has been a long and hard road to attain the progress we have achieved today in Manchuria. For so long it seemed as if our nation held on by a thread, subservient to the whims of larger, more powerful nations. As always, however, Providence smiled upon the snowy hills of Manchuria and delivered us from complete destruction. I can now say with confidence that today I am your deliverance. For years, incompetent and self-serving fools allowed a deep rot to set in within the Manchurian government. Wang Yongjiang had been losing his mind for years, and with his departure we were able to see just how fragile our government had become. It was a passive institution, run by dying men and power-hungry women. With the passing of our beloved emperor, who had worked to intervene and stop this decline, I was confronted with the reality that there would be a war for the soul of Manchuria. Would we allow ourselves to be a nation of weak men and arrogant women? I think not. I think, as do many, that we are a nation born from the blood-soaked soil of fallen warriors, which was first fertilized during the war against the Tsar. I think we are a nation that is best suited to traditional values, so that the way of the warrior does not perish from an ever-softening world. I knew that if I left our nation's fate up to the forces that held sway over it, soon we would no longer have a nation. For proof of this, look at the line of succession. If I had not intervened with the swiftness and determination that I did, our nation was one oath of office away from being led by an inexperienced girl, who would most certainly be easily manipulated by the nefarious powers that seek our ruin. This was a risk that I, as a true son of Manchuria, could not take. And so here I stand, ready to proclaim the return of the old order of military rule. We shall not be ruled by fear, however, but by common sense. The shape I plan for this to take is the elimination of dissent to create a strong national government. The first step of this plan involves the top-down control of every aspect of our nation, all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, as a true visionary once said. From here, from this total control, we shall marshal our national resources for the greatness of our nation. It is here that we... Takagi's speech would then be interrupted, as the general noticed a commotion in the crowd. Spectators looked with disdain and disgust as a drunken tramp, greasy and unshaven, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. As the man reached the barrier between the stage and the crowd, he stopped to catch his breath, looking up a few seconds later to match Takagi's stare, who had just noticed his presence. The man's eyes bulged in sheer hatred, and he inhaled deeply before letting out a roar with a sentence thrown in it. "Takagi, you scum! Just as my dream was taken from me, so too will yours be taken from you. This is for Yuri." In a flash, the man pulled out a revolver and began firing wildly at the stage, striking one of Takagi's guards as well as a girl in the crowd. Takagi's bodyguards drew their guns and fired wildly into the crowd, riddling the man with bullets as well as several innocent onlookers. The man's lifeless body soon collapsed to the ground, his hands clutching a photograph of a young boy, taken long ago. Tamashima Shoryu rushed to Takagi, who stood holding his chest. Gasping for air, the general then collapsed to the ground, a pool of crimson staining his perfectly tailored suit. One of the bullets had ripped through his lungs as well as an artery. Takagi, coughing up blood, uttered something weakly in Korean. "I still have so much left to do." With that, General Takagi Masao bled to death as the crowd fled in a panic. The assassin was later identified as former rebel Kim Il-sung, whose family had been killed by Takagi years ago, and who had been presumed KIA after the Manchurian revolt. In the aftermath of Takagi's assassination, foreign press agencies declared Manchuria to be a failed state, Indeed, the nation was in chaos as Takagi's military junta, bound by his power and charisma, began to crumble just as quickly as it had formed. Konstantin Rodzaevsky withdrew his support for the junta and began gathering an army of White Russians to carve out a Russian ethnostate in Manchuria. Ika Nakajima would soon be killed by Rodzaevsky's men after confronting him on his perceived betrayal. As the junta crumbled, Tamashima Shoryu consolidated what loyal men remained under the promise of reunification with Japan, the restoration of Puyi to the throne, and declared himself to be the supreme leader of Manchuria. All the while, sections of the military who were loyal to Takagi but less loyal to the fools who had succeeded him flocked to support Iwasato Masao, who would offer general amnesty to all but a select few. Indeed, by the morning of the 17th, the American government, as well as the CIA, had reached out to General Iwasato to declare their support for the formation of a new military government under his rule. Now, to the shock of both the Americans and his closest advisors, General Iwasato announced that his intentions were more constitutional than that. In a phone call with CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkotter, General Iwasato was reported to have said, "While I am appreciative of all those who have thrown their weight behind me, I must make it clear I have no aspirations of leading this nation alone. I wish for you to separate my actions from those of Takagi and the vipers who now fight over his corpse. I took up arms for a dear friend of mine, the Speaker of the Legislative Council. I fight only for a constitutional transfer of power to the next in line, Speaker Li Jianlan. I am partial to the creation of a hybrid regime under martial law led by us both, just as we did during the defense of Fushun. I know full well the optics of the path I am suggesting my nation take. I know a woman leading a nation is something unprecedented in the democratic governments of the world, and yet I must insist that Li be the next leader of Manchuria. She is fiercely loyal to this land. She is a charismatic politician popular across the political spectrum. She has years of experience in being a leader and a proven record of being more than capable of governing. Unlike myself, Li was born in Manchuria. She speaks multiple languages and can relate to all of her fellow countrymen. My home is on the island of Formosa. And lastly, to counter your concerns about the optics of all this, think of the optics of the result of Takagi's coup simply being a different general leading the nation. History will look upon me as an opportunistic leader who capitalized on the death of an equally ruthless man to seize total power. If you want to avoid instability, avoid chaos, and ensure that the red hand of communism shall never again touch the land of Manchuria, then you need to back Li Jianlan. At this point, General Iwasato was hung up on by Director Hillenkotter. Hours later, he received a brief phone call. Hillenkotter would utter 3 words that would change the history of Manchuria forever. It's a go. With this, Iwasato's plans were set into motion, as his forces launched simultaneous attacks against the forces of both Tamashima and Rodzaevsky, who soon realized that they were hopelessly outnumbered. By January 19th, Tamashima and Jiejeshu had been killed in a mortar strike, while Rodzaevsky had been betrayed and turned over to Iwasato's forces, who hung him for treason. That same day, as Iwasato's forces swept across Manchuria, Kawashima Yoshiko, who had remained in the shadows awaiting the crisis's resolution, formally came out in support of the general. With all resistance crushed in this stunning reversal, General Iwasato would assume the role of Supreme Commander of the Manchurian Armed Forces, with General Davis ceding all power to him following a directive from Washington. As his first action, General Iwasato declared the third dissolution of Qing dynasty rule in Asia, paving the way for an interim government and a future republic. On January 20th, General Iwasato himself led a strike force to Hulunbuir, where he received the surrender of the remaining Takagi loyalists, who laid down their arms without a fight. Iwasato made his way to the imposing Hulunbuir prison, where, in a private cell on the second floor, he finally found Li Jianlan, unharmed and deep in thought as she awaited her execution. Li, in shock at Iwasato's arrival, would walk out of the prison a free woman on the day she was supposed to die. Cut off from the outside world, Li had no knowledge of Iwasato's uprising or the junta's defeat, and was in awe as Iwasato relayed to her the current reality they found themselves living in. General Iwasato then spoke. "My good friend, you have an opportunity before you now that you would never thought possible, and it is one you must seize. The military and the people stand ready to proclaim a republic in Manchuria, and on behalf of the Manchurian High Command, it is requested that you ascend the presidency to lead the nation in tandem with the military. The Americans support you, the military supports you, and I know the people will support you. Harbin awaits. Do you accept?" While taken aback by the gravity of the situation, Li nodded. She would do anything for her country. She was ready. Maybe she'd been ready all along. As the two and their entourage took in the blinding light of the pale Manchurian sun, a black shape descended to the frozen field outside the prison. It was a Sikorsky H-19, ready to transport Li and Iwasato to Harbin, where they would restore order and formally establish a new government. Iwasato and Li would enter together. As the Sikorsky took off, Iwasato's men watched it intently, well aware that they had just witnessed history in the making. On the afternoon of January 20th, 1950, the Sikorsky helicopter carrying Li and General Iwasato would touch down at a USFM base located on Harbin's Taiyang Island. The pair would be greeted by General Davis, who had arranged a motorcade to transport the two of them to the Legislative Council building, where Li was to make a speech at once to end the confusion and chaos surrounding the state of the government. After arriving at the Legislative Council, Li Jianlan would be handed a hastily prepared speech and put before a mob of reporters, their eyes frenzied in excitement and anxiety. Ascending to the speaker's podium in the center of the rotunda, Li began a speech in Chinese. My fellow Manchurians, I come to you today just as weary of the violence as you, dear citizens. However, I come bearing good news of resolution. Today, the last remnants of General Takagi's insurrection laid down their arms in Hulunbuir. Despite many foreseeing this crisis as the death knell of Manchuria, I see now that it was our last great test before we could realize our full potential. We are a nation comprised of many peoples, each with different origins and stories and ways of experiencing and viewing the world. Peoples who have been subjugated and peoples who have subjugated others. We live at the crossroads of the Orient. Some have thought this makes us weak, but I see our many cultures as adding to the strength of our national character. Because to love Manchuria is not to love a specific people, but a land, a sky, beautiful rivers and mountains. To love Manchuria is to love the life we have built here. We are not loyal to a specific ethnic group, but to the place where we have chosen to place our roots. Manchus, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Mongolians, Russians, and mixed-race peoples. Men, women, children, all of us are Manchurian. No one ever said living in a multi-ethnic nation would be easy, especially in Manchuria, where our national story began with imperialism and totalitarianism. But, just as the late Zhang Jingguo believed would happen, our chances come to build a powerful and magnificent nation, a society that fosters greatness to pass down to future generations and defends against all threats to its sovereignty, values, and people. We have had our problems, but we work every day to mend these wrongs and ensure harmony. With these efforts, we may yet realize our destiny of a utopian state under benevolent rule, many races under one nation. This is the Manchuria I have always dreamed of, and I think it is the Manchuria that the vast majority of my countrymen have also dreamed of. And now we have passed our last great test as a nation. We have triumphed over communism and fascism. We have defied the odds with our unity. Now begins the hard work of ensuring that this new, final peace is everlasting. With the end of the insurrection, we can rejoice. At the same moment, we must recognize why General Takagi became so emboldened. After the passing of our great emperor and his heir into the heavens, we were left without a government. Without a suitable heir, the National Transitional Committee has voted to abolish our emperor's throne, for there is no one who could live up to his greatness. In his stead, the National Transitional Committee and the armed forces of Manchuria have suggested the creation of a republic in our nation. Accordingly, I, Li Jianlan, born Yamaguchi Yoshiko, today before you proclaim the birth of the Republic of Manchuria. As the highest-ranking surviving elected representative, I shall accept the duties endowed to me by the previous constitution and ascend to the executive office, now the presidency. At this point, Li's speech would be briefly interrupted by the entrance of Master Zhuanhua of Harbin's Zhanyuan Monastery, who had arrived to administer the newly drafted oath of office. Do you, Li Jianlan, solemnly and sincerely swear before the people of Manchuria that you will observe the Constitution, faithfully perform your duties, promote the welfare of the people, safeguard the security of the state, and maintain the people's trust? I, Li Jianlan, born Yamaguchi Yoshiko, do solemnly and sincerely swear before the people of Manchuria that I shall observe the Constitution, faithfully perform my duties, promote the welfare of the people, safeguard the security of the state, and maintain the people's trust. I swear this before the people on the 20th of January, 1950. With this oath, we do acknowledge you as the President of Manchuria. Long live President Li Jianlan. Long live Manchuria, said Master Zhuanhua. In unison, all present repeated this chant before erupting into applause as a storm of camera flashes washed over Manchuria's new president, before subsiding and allowing her speech to continue. I am aware that I alone cannot accomplish the task of steering Manchuria to prosperity. Accordingly, in my first act as president, I am appointing General Iwasato Masao to the dual offices of Vice President and Secretary of Defense. This is just the first piece of the coalition I will build to ensure Manchuria's success. As part of these efforts, our government, for the foreseeable future, will function as a hybrid regime under martial law. The executive and legislative branches will be under dual governance, half civilian and half military. While the continuance of martial law and the postponement of democratic elections is not ideal, the military leadership has made the executive decision based on the existence of the persistent external forces that pose a threat to our nation, even after we have conquered our internal divisions. Let us build a strong nation together, so that democracy and prosperity will someday blossom. Our situation is not static. For Manchuria, at the crossroads of Asia, is a mighty boulder in the currents of time, an immovable object that parts the river of destiny, a place where nothing is predetermined. Our destinies lie in our own hands, for we live in freedom's frontier, the space where liberty and tyranny touch. Today, the people have taken the first step towards reiterating their sovereignty. Long live the people. Long live Manchuria. This is your president, Li Jianlan, signing off. Li Jianlan would then leave the crowd of stunned reporters to privately re-record her speech in Japanese, Korean, Mongolian, Russian, and yes, even the nearly extinct Manchu language. Her speeches would be broadcast on a loop for 48 hours from the Manchuria broadcast tower. While the idea of a female president gave many citizens pause, the nation agreed no one was more qualified to rule Manchuria than Li Jianlan, who was a native-born Manchurian, a proven leader, and a charismatic figure who walked in both the Chinese and Japanese worlds. Her rule would slowly but surely be accepted, greatly aided by the power-sharing agreement she had established with the very much respected General Iwasato, which many scholars credited with enabling her succession to the presidency without facing another coup. January 25th would see the funeral of Emperor Zaifeng, who was buried with full honors under the Qing banner in Mukden in an elaborate ceremony despite Manchuria's new status as a republic. As the nation mourned the loss of their emperor, the choir and band of the Manchurian armed forces would perform the national anthem since 1945, Cup of Solid Gold, aloud a final time in honor of the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. Later that day, in Harbin, the armed forces would debut the Republic's new national anthem, Peace and Concord, which had formerly been the party anthem of the Concordia Party, which, under Li Jianlan, had now come to dominate Manchuria's government. Over the next few months, the Republic of Manchuria would begin to repair itself under the leadership of President Li and Vice President Iwasato. The two would begin their rule by rebuilding the government, with the Americans opting for a more hands-off approach this time due to Washington placing greater trust in General Iwasato than they had in Wang Yongjiang. January would see the appointment of General Chai Myung-shin as Speaker of the Legislative Council, since renamed the Legislative Assembly after the birth of the Republic, agricultural scientist Wu Jiangchun as Secretary of Agriculture, Kawashima Yoshiko as Director of the Manchurian Central Intelligence Agency, or MCIA for short, Lu Ronghuan, an experienced career diplomat, as Secretary of State, and Aikawa Yoshisuke as Secretary of the Treasury. On February 2nd, President Li would meet with American Ambassador Asakawa Kanichi, who would congratulate Li on her historic ascension to the presidency, as well as reaffirm Washington's support for Manchuria. The meeting would end cordially with Ambassador Asakawa extending an invitation from President Truman for her to visit Washington in the near future. That same day, Li would sit down for an interview with Time magazine, who would run an article about the world's first non-royal female head of state. As Manchuria stabilized, spring 1950 would see the return of American investment and a rise in the value of the benkan. However, the first major challenge for the Republic would also arise in the form of a massive surge in crime following General Takagi's insurrection. Groups like the Triads, the Yakuza, and other criminal organizations and secret societies had already been thriving amidst the crushing poverty that had engulfed Manchuria after the Manchurian Revolt, and the recent insurrection and accompanying financial crash had only further driven many impoverished Manchurians to industries like opium manufacturing, dealing, and prostitution. The pervasiveness of opium was a legacy of the Yamada Otozo regime, where opium production had been an established industry subsidized and encouraged by the Kwantung Army and Manchukuo puppet government. The connections that had been forged between businessmen, gangs, and growers had been strong enough to withstand the chaos that followed the end of the Second World War. Despite Dr. Wu Jiangchun's efforts to shift Manchurian agriculture away from opium production, the illicit industry had continued, metastasizing in power and scope under Prime Ministers Jiang and Wang due to each administration's focus on matters of national security. Likewise, while Lin Zhe had been able to subdue crime to a degree, after his betrayal and the ensuing poverty, organized crime made a comeback. The Manchurian armed forces, weakened from the coup attempt, struggled to maintain order on the streets of the nation's large cities. In response to this, General Iwasato was eager to begin a crackdown on the flow of opium, but was stopped by President Li. Li argued that before the opium trade was broken, the desperate people who worked in it, apart from the gangs, needed an alternative. Right now, there was none. If the government took on the criminals now, they would only be replaced within a few years by their current underlings. No, they needed a viable alternative first. Li's response, the Manchurian Welfare Initiative, sought to construct a safety net for the nation's poorest and end the opium epidemic once and for all. The first step began with the children. Many orphans had been created through the successive waves of violence in the 1940s, and most had ended up on the streets, with existing orphanages overcrowded, underfunded, and rife with mistreatment and poor sanitation. These street children were at great risk of exploitation via recruitment into the criminal underworld, particularly with regard to induction into the triads or yakuza. In response to a study that showed there were tens of thousands of these street children, President Li ordered the creation of the Department of Women and Children. To lead the Department of Women and Children, President Li was confronted with a big decision. Who could best understand the plight of the children, as well as women who had been affected by opium addiction and its accompanying ills? Li's plight was solved on March 15, 1950, when she received a request for an audience from someone she'd long forgotten about, Wanrong, the Empress of Manchukuo. Wanrong, who had been broken down by years of psychosis, suffering, and addiction, had been in a psychiatric hospital in Xinjiang from 1945, when General Wainwright had ordered her committed, until 1946, when she had been fully detoxed. Wanrong had then been transferred to an experimental sanatorium in Rishiri, off the coast of Hokkaido, which was focused on rehabilitation. At the sanatorium, Wanrong had undergone multiple intensive therapies based on the latest breakthroughs in psychiatry and mental rehabilitation. All of this had been quietly paid for by Emperor Zaifeng. With a strict regimen of medication and many hours in experimental therapy, Wanrong had regained her sense of self, along with the sense of peace, by December 1949. However, her release had been delayed following the Takagi insurrection. But on March 10th, Wanrong had at last been released from custody, having regained her sanity and gained for the first time in her life a sense of peace. By March 13th, the Empress was back in Manchuria, shocked to find that her husband was no longer ruling, nor was there even a monarchy. A woman led the nation now, to her shock. The meeting between the two women on March 15th was about Wanrong's desire to acquire a few personal effects from the former royal palace in Xinjiang, which was now a government-owned property. President Li wholly agreed and was happy to listen to the former empress discuss her journey towards healing after years of horror in Manchukuo. Wanrong declared that her goal now was to use what funds she still retained from Puyi's reign to start a relief center for women and children in need. However, it was then that the president asked Wanrong how she would feel running an entire governmental body dedicated to that cause, to which Wanrong, while taken aback, responded that it would be an immense honor. While no offer was made that day, it was their first meeting ever after all, President Li put Wanrong in the running to be Secretary of Women and Children. After further meetings as well as discussion with General Iwasato, on April 30th, 1950, Gobyeo Wanrong, the last empress of China, was confirmed by a military tribunal as the Secretary of Women and Children. Additionally, Wanrong would be made the legal guardian of her nephew, Aisin-Jodo Yuzheng. As a funding stopgap, until the government could obtain a steady source of funding, the Department of Women and Children would be funded with money earned from selling off the assets of war criminals convicted by Zheng Yushu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. On May 3, 1950, President Li took her first trip abroad to Washington, D.C., to meet with President Truman. While Truman was still very much acclimating to the idea of a woman president in any part of the world, much less Manchuria, he was cordial to President Li, with Bess Truman giving her a tour of Washington, D.C. While on her trip to Washington, Li lobbied for more foreign aid to Manchuria to accelerate her nation's recovery, as well as updates to its security infrastructure. With the help of Asakawa Kanichi, who had been delivering daily reports to Washington of Li Xianglan's progress, Li successfully persuaded President Truman to give Manchuria a development grant of $1 billion, the equivalent of $13 billion today, which is what Taiwan received in our timeline. Returning to Manchuria after her success in Washington, on May 10, 1950, in coordination with General Iwasato, Li Xianglan announced her first 5-year plan, centered around revitalizing Manchurian industry, including coal, steel, and chemical manufacturing. However, while the 5-year plan, as well as the Department of Women and Children, got off to a strong start thanks to American funding, nothing could prepare Li Xianglan for what would come next. On June 1st, the office of the president received a letter from Jie Jiarong, a Chinese geologist who specialized in the study of mineral deposits and energy deposits. Jie, now living in exile in the United States, had once been part of a Chinese government mineral survey office in the 1930s, where he developed a theory that there may be oil hidden underneath the Songliao Plain in Manchuria. However, he had kept his findings to himself after the beginning of turmoil in China, not wanting this information to fall into the hands of the Japanese. Likewise, regardless of his animosity towards Manchuria, Jie hated the Soviet annexation of China far more. This led him to the conclusion that Li Jianlan, the new, reformist-minded leader of Manchuria, should be entrusted with this knowledge for the betterment of the people, regardless of the government's politics. Jie recommended that President Li send out survey teams to search for oil underneath the Songliao Plains sedimentary basin, adding that there was a good certainty a modest amount of oil may be found. After coordinating with Treasury Secretary Aikawa, who told Li that the discovery of oil would propel her 5-year plan far beyond current expectations, the government of Manchuria would mobilize a team of scientists and soldiers led by Brigadier General Paik Son-yop, which would begin their expedition by heading to a part of the Songliao Plain near the town of Xingren on June 15, 1950. The Xingren location was chosen because the part of the plain in that area was an uplift area that showed promise of containing an anticline structure underground. In layman's terms, it looked like a great spot to drill for oil. Drilling began on June 17th, and 3 days later, the drilling team would strike oil, with the black gold shooting out of the ground to the jubilation of the workers. When news broke of the discovery of oil, investment in Manchuria drastically increased. Treasury Secretary Aikawa would shift his priorities to managing the birth of a renewed energy industry in Manchuria. Rapidly, the small town of Xingren would transform into a boom town, as men in desperate need of work signed up to perform the grueling and dangerous task of extracting the oil. While there were some initial offers made by multinational companies to purchase control of the operations in the newly christened Songliao oil field, General Iwasato would issue a general order fully declaring the Songliao oil field property of the Manchurian government. Accordingly, the oil produced was also the property of the government, and the ensuing corporation created to manage the oil production, refinement, sale, and revenue, Manchurian Petroleum, was a firmly nationalized corporate entity from its inception. Grateful for the generosity of the American government, Manchuria quickly arranged a beneficial trade deal for oil sales to the United States Pacific Territories, Choson, and Japan. Likewise, the oil boom did much for Manchuria's international relations. As was aforementioned, in the aftermath of the Second World War, much of the world had shunned Manchuria. While Choson, Japan, El Salvador, and the United States had been Manchuria's earliest and most steadfast supporters, elsewhere the nation was a pariah state whose reputation had only worsened after the publication of the secret dissertation on the crimes of Manchukuo. However, with newfound geopolitical capital amidst the nation's oil boom, overnight Manchuria received multiple overtures from nations across the world who now wished to formally establish diplomatic relations. This marked the beginning of Manchurian petrodiplomacy, where the nation's natural resource exports would help it attain international recognition. By late summer, Manchuria had established diplomatic relations with every South American nation, Spain, Portugal, Haiti, Liberia, South Asia, Anampuchia, Thailand, and Mafilindo. However, the USSR remained unwilling to engage with Manchuria and rallied its allies in the UN to continue to block the push for the admittance of Manchuria to the United Nations. Now, with the oil having begun to flow, the Manchurian Welfare Initiative could continue. With Wanrong working to get the nation's street children to safety, Li Jianlan, in coordination with Chai Myung-shin, would launch the next phase, the construction of a social security system to aid the poorest of the nation. The next part of the plan was done for her following the discovery of oil. Many destitute men would journey to the new boomtowns across the Songliao Plain to work. For those who didn't or couldn't, concurrently the frenzied flow of foreign investment also helped to create thousands of new jobs nearly overnight. 1950 would be declared the Year of National Healing by Li Jianlan in a speech to the nation that November. 1950 would come to an end with the nation celebrating the release of the first post-war Manchurian film. On December 10th, the Manchuria Film Association would release its first film, The Nishan Shaman, a film adaptation of a traditional Manchu folk story about a shaman who raises the dead, updated and set primarily in post-war Manchuria, focusing on themes of loss, recovery, and rebirth. The Nishan Shaman would be released to critical acclaim with both Mandarin and Manchu versions, as well as subtitles in English, Japanese, Korean, Russian, and Mongolian. The film would enjoy a nationwide release as well as limited releases in Choson, Japan, and Mafilindo. The film's success would cement the Manchuria Film Association, often shortened to MANE, as one of Asia's preeminent film studios. In her Chinese New Year's address on February 6th, Li Jianglong would inaugurate the Year of the Rabbit with a call to destroy the nation's remaining societal ills and foster the spirit of brotherhood. Many immediately interpreted the veiled threat hidden in her words of celebration. With the economy on the rebound, the time had come for Manchuria to destroy the opium trade once and for all. On February 15, 1951, General Iwasato and the Manchurian armed forces began a brutal crackdown on the drug trade. Under martial law, due process would be revoked, and soldiers were permitted to fire at will during simultaneous raids across the nation, targeting the underground smuggling network. Because the criminal groups operated many illicit industries at once, the operation on February 15th, codenamed Operation Taifurambi, which was the Manchu word for treating a sickness, would concurrently disrupt Manchuria's arms trafficking, human trafficking, and opium trafficking industries all at once, with the military achieving an astounding success. Observers would later conclude that the criminal underworld had completely ignored Li Jianglong's warnings, viewing the leader as inexperienced and lacking the resolve to allow such an action. From the data gathered in the initial raid, the military was able to pursue the smaller networks of suppliers, dealers, and opium dens. Dealers and suppliers were usually killed on sight, while the addicts of the opium dens were sent to government-run rehabilitation sites funded by the new oil revenue. By the summer of 1951, Manchuria had begun to resolve the opium crisis. The addicts, having quit cold turkey, were given the choice of either moving in with relatives or beginning a work release program in the Songliao oil fields or the textile factories of Xinjiang. Late 1951 would see the expansion of industrialization across the Songliao Plain, with the region being cemented as the heart of Manchurian industry. Many new factories, ranging from the mass production of chemical products to processed foods to textiles, would commence production using existing industrial infrastructure created by the Japanese during the war. Developments in the far south of the Songliao Plain would see the birth of modern industrialized farming to produce increased crop yields. In particular, the Manchurian government would encourage sorghum production with the introduction of sorghum subsidies. Not only was the grain cheap and nutritious enough to support a growing population, but the push towards sorghum-focused farming was also the first step of the government's plan to create a unified Manchurian identity, beginning with Manchurian cuisine. These efforts would culminate in the publishing of Patriotic Nourishment, a government-published cookbook given for free as a resource to help hungry and growing families better support themselves. Recipes included sorghum bread, a deep brown loaf that was nutritionally dense and became a mainstay of every Manchurian household, okoshi, a crisp sweet made with sorghum, buckwheat soba noodles, Manchurian ration, a paste made of seaweed and potatoes, gyoza, a Manchurian variation of the Chinese jiazhi, sorghum and millet porridge, and mashed mutton with red beans and rice. Accompanying the release of Patriotic Nourishment would be the announcement of the Manchu Children's Cultural Revival, a program under the authority of the Department of Women and Children designed to encourage the retainment and growth of Manchu culture amongst Manchu youth and foster a revival of the dying Manchu language. Amidst these major reforms, calls for elections to be held would continually lessen. By early 1952, surveys showed that the people of Manchuria decisively supported the hybrid regime. Following the dissemination of this knowledge, General Iwasato, overriding Li Jianglong's suggestions, would extend martial law indefinitely in a bill sent to the Legislative Assembly. Because Speaker Chai had packed the Legislative Assembly with loyal figures from the military and Concordia Party cadres, the bill to extend martial law for national rejuvenation passed unanimously. Amidst the rapid creation of a one-party state, the sole voice against the government was the Iron Blood Party, who resented Li Jianglong's efforts to co-opt the legacies of Jiang Jingguo and Wang Yongjiang. However, with their leadership having mostly been killed in the 1947 bombing, the party was a powerless shell of its former self. The only surviving Iron Blood politician, Wang Yongjiang, had quietly passed away the year before. In regular speeches to the citizenry, Li Jianglong would reaffirm her commitment to an open democracy and free elections, as soon as the country had realized its goals of complete sovereignty, stability, and prosperity. While the USFM had secured the Soviet-Manchurian border, even 9 years later, Cathay SSR leader Wang Ming had continued to promote Cathay's irredentist claims regarding Manchuria, denying the state's legitimacy and calling Li Jianglong a Japanese imperialist and Western puppet. Regularly, mass demonstrations against Li's government would be held in Beijing, where Li would be burned in effigy and Manchurian flags would be burned and trampled. Wang Ming himself would popularize a nickname for Li amongst the Chinese, referring to her derogatorily as the Yankee Empress. While Stalin was dead, the Manchurian government still feared that Moscow would at any moment give in to Wang's demands and give him the green light to invade Manchuria, with this paranoia being driven by the USSR's continued refusals to engage in any sort of dialogue with the Manchurians. As the Cold War heated up in the 1950s, so too did fears that Manchuria would once again become a battleground for two larger powers. These fears would escalate following confirmed reports of multiple Soviet nuclear tests being conducted in the Primorsky territory throughout 1953. These tests, which occurred in the region directly bordering Manchuria, greatly unnerved the Manchurian government, which was otherwise preoccupied with its own successes. In a meeting with U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles on January 3, 1954, Li Jianlan requested American assistance in helping Manchuria develop nuclear weapons to further deter Soviet aggression. President Li's request would be quickly rebuffed, as would a follow-up request to have American nuclear weapons stationed in Manchuria. All that would come with the meeting would be some paltry financial aid and resources to help Manchuria explore peaceful atomic energy development. At the very least, from the Americans, Manchuria obtained schematics for a research reactor, openly declaring that they intended to use it to develop peaceful nuclear energy. However, by now, General Iwasato and President Li were convinced that obtaining nuclear weapons was the only way the Soviets would ever take the Manchurian government seriously, and dispel the lingering notion that Manchuria was a failed state and rightfully part of the USSR. On January 20th, 1955, while the Republic of Manchuria celebrated its 5th anniversary in the 5th year of Li Jianlan's rule, the government was busy orchestrating the creation of a Manchurian nuclear program. The Manchurian nuclear program, which drew all of its funding from the Songliao oil fields, was kept top secret, especially from the prying eyes of the USFM, who would immediately halt any research to keep Manchuria dependent on Uncle Sam. It was on the 5th anniversary of the Republic that General Iwasato approved the creation of the Amatadasu project, a secret program to obtain a fully functional atomic bomb within a decade. The Amatadasu project would start with only a name and a dream, but it would quickly grow into so much more throughout 1955. The headquarters for the Amatadasu project would be rapidly constructed on the outskirts of Hulunbuir, including a fortified security perimeter as well as around-the-clock surveillance, with construction finishing on June 26, 1955. The official explanation given both to the Manchurian people and the Americans was that the Hulunbuir compound was for the storage and destruction of recently uncovered Japanese biological weapons developed as part of the abandoned attack plan known as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. As for materials, the Manchurians, in their quest to develop nuclear energy, would strike a deal with Choson in September 1955, wherein Manchuria would purchase all of the leftover materials and data located in Sinanju, Choson, where the Japanese had harvested nuclear materials before and during World War II, including important precursor materials. At the Hulunbuir compound, the greatest and most trustworthy nuclear scientists from across Manchuria would be recruited to begin working on the project. However, the project still required a leader, someone with experience in developing nuclear bombs. In November 1955, General Iwasato would at last find a suitable leader for the Amaterasu project, Dr. Arakatsu Bunsaku, a nuclear physicist who had been one of the biggest contributors to the Imperial Japanese nuclear program, just behind Nishina Yoshio, who had passed away in 1951. However, despite Nishina's death, Arakatsu was still alive and in possession of Nishina's research as well as his own. Lastly, Arakatsu also knew the location of Nishina's cyclotrons, which had been hidden after Japan's surrender knowing the Americans would destroy them. On March 10, 1956, Dr. Arakatsu would covertly make the journey to Manchuria on board a Manchurian freight ship, with all of the research and cyclotrons in tow. Following Arakatsu's arrival, progress on the bomb drastically accelerated as the Li administration, to quote one scientist, threw more money at us than we knew what to do with, end quote. The rest of the 1950s would see Manchuria's complete economic recovery and the beginning of real economic growth, as the remaining peasant communities became fully integrated into the nation's fast-paced society. In 1957, the Manchurian government bought out the remaining private investors who owned MANA, also known as the Manchurian Film Association, fully nationalizing the company and making it Manchuria's official state cinema company. In 1958, seeking to diversify its portfolio, the Manchuria Film Association, which was also the main vehicle for music and television media, would formally establish the Manchuria Recording Group Corporation, a government-owned record label that would inherit almost 75% of the entire national catalog of published music. From here, thanks to the oil boom, Manchurian music, from all of its communities, would begin to be produced en masse as many young artists became signed and began their careers as professional musicians. On June 25, 1960, a special government meeting would be held upon Dr. Arakatsu's request. Before President Li, General Iwasato, and Director Kawashima, Dr. Arakatsu would announce that the Amaterasu project had finished work on Manchuria's first atomic bomb, a pure fission weapon designated Nurhachi, named in honor of the Manchu warlord who unified the Manchurian tribes and paved the way for the conquest of China. On July 15, 1960, President Li, General Iwasato, and Director Kawashima, together with the Amatadasu scientists and Dr. Anakatsu, would gather in a fortified control bunker at a test site located in the most barren stretch of the Gobi Manchurian steppe in western Manchuria. The group would put on their provided goggles, and shortly thereafter, a countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nurhachi successfully detonated, scorching the earth around it. The sky, which had been cloudy, shone bright as the explosion illuminated the heavens. A ball of fire shot in the air, shaped like a mushroom. A minute after detonation, a shockwave struck the control bunker, rattling it as the sky was bathed in light. Many were at a loss for words, including the general and the president. One voice, Dr. Adakatsu's, broke the silence in the bunker as the roar of the explosion still permeated the background. At this moment, a poem by the poet Li Yuyang came to Dr. Adakatsu's mind, a modified version of which was recited by him. The cloud is like a dragon's breath on the mountains. Winds howl, circling and swirling. The fire shakes the stars, and the flames beat down on the world. An earthquake of fire is now unleashed.